The ancient ruins of Rauh are one of the most deeply mysterious regions in all of Elden Ring. They stretch across the entire continent, quite literally supporting the very earth that every civilization after them was built upon. These immense stone temples also form the cultural bedrock for much of the modern lands between, and exploring these connections will reveal a cycle of empires centered around the loss and recovery of the Elden Ring itself. While these overgrown halls don't give us much in the form of a written history, what we do possess is a wealth of environmental details and cultural links, from which we can parse how Rauh fits into the greater timeline of the lands between. Today we will explore the cultural practices, technological advancements, and eventual fall of this ancient empire at the hands of the fell god. Before we begin, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Seahat, our resident Rauh expert, who shared a lot of valuable insights with me for this video. So, let's now begin our exploration of this beautiful ruin. We will begin with a well-established but still very important observation about Rauh, that it was inhabited by both giants and humans. We find a mummified version of one such giant strung up within the specimen storehouse, and this is further confirmed by the forge of the fire giants being supported by Rauh pillars. It's important to note for later that it is only the giants of the mountaintops which are true fire giants. The remains taken from Rauh itself notably lack the visage of the fell god upon their chest. We know that humans also inhabited these ruins simply based upon the architecture, with many sets of stairs and doorways being clearly designed for those of human stature. In addition to who inhabited these ruins, we can also conclude that the hierarchy of Rauh was matriarchal in nature, as all of its grandest statues honor female figures. There are two sets of figures which are particularly interesting. There are the three priestesses, whose conical headpieces bear a striking similarity to that of the Nox Night Maidens, and there is another, much larger set of statues which portray a single individual of massive importance. I will refer to this figure as the goddess for the remainder of this video, although others in my circle have dubbed her as Elden Jane in the tradition of Elden John. She wears an 8-sided crown, which is a motif that is central to Rauh architecture, not just in the Shadowlands, but all across the lands between. The pillars of this civilization, which are the most prominent feature of its architecture, also bear this 8-sided design. Wearing a headpiece with geometry so highly valued by those of Rauh, along with the sheer size of her statues, marks her as the most important figure in Rauh's social strata. Another important detail are her two braids, worn in a similar style to that of contemporary shamans, most notably by Marika. These braids are not just a superficial similarity, they are tied to pertinent rituals of ancestral worship practiced by Numen-associated cultures. Our next clue about this statue comes from this civilization's link to the crucible of all life, a force said to be particularly potent within Rauh. As I have spoken of before, the true nature of the crucible is the Elden Ring itself, the seed from which all life in the lands began. It is no coincidence that Rauh exists in close proximity to where the Erd Tree, which grew from the crucible's vital energies, exists today. They built their civilization around the original golden starfall which blessed the lands. To lend additional support to this idea, it is likely that the Hornsent only learned how to create their divine tower as a result of their study of the ruins of Rauh, and the powerful crucible currents which flowed through the region. This tower, and the gateway at its apex, were created for the sole purpose of retrieving the lost Elden Ring, using a god as its vessel. This crucible-worshipping society desires the Elden Ring for themselves because, in the past, they were one and the same. And so, in light of her clear importance to Rauh, her cultural links to Queen Marika and the Nox, and the strength of the Elden Ring's vital energies within this civilization, I believe it is clear that this statue depicts a goddess, a vessel for the Elden Ring, and the ruler of Rauh. Deep within Rauh, we find the talisman of all crucibles, a giant mass of intermingling crucible attributes, rumored to have spread upon giants, and is known as the mother of crucibles in ancient tower lore. The most potent blessings of the crucible were found in ancient times and blessed the giants. We see this clearly on the giant in the specimen storehouse, and in the equally massive horned beasts, likely also taken from the ruins. This makes sense, for the crucible is said to have been where all life was once melded together, and so the first primordial beings to arise from it must have carried the largest shards of its power, and were truly gargantuan in size. These were the ancient dragons and the massive titans, as they have been dubbed by the community, who are found all across the lands between, buried deep within the earth. Then came the giants of Rauh, who, while still massive, pale in comparison to their forebears. I don't believe that the Titans ever could have been a part of Rauh society. They are simply too massive. Additionally, the ancient meteoric greatsword was fashioned from an excavated shard of an arrowhead that was once part of the old god's arsenal. If this colossal greatsword is merely a shard of an arrowhead, this weapon could have only belonged to the Titans. This description also tells us that the old gods predate Rauh by such a long period that their artifacts needed to be excavated, proving that they were long dead by this time. Instead, I think these titans are best understood through the lens of Norse mythology, on which Elden Ring's lore is loosely based. In the myth, the giant Ymir was the first primordial being to come into existence, and after he was slain, his body was fashioned into the very world. The old gods were the earliest humanoids born of the crucible, whose death gave rise to the continent itself. For those of you who are curious of where exactly each culture fits into this timeline, this is my current idea of the order of the early civilizations. This timeline is based on much more research than I can fit into a single video, but I'll be making future content about each culture mentioned here to support the connections I've made thus far. My full, far more detailed timeline Miro board is also available for Tier 2 members if that interests you. As history progresses, the Elden Ring's power, in the form of runes, becomes less and less concentrated, and smaller, less invested creatures came into existence. Remember that the runes of the Elden Ring are the life force of all beings, and we see clearly that the ring is losing power over time when comparing the modern-day Elden Ring with America to the ancient and far more complex depiction of the ring in Farum Azula. The giant crusher tells us that man has grown feeble in comparison to his forebears, and I believe this idea is a constant for life throughout the world. The more life there is, the less runic power each individual contains. This is why the theme of combining the life force of many beings into one is so common within almost every culture of the lands between. We even do this ourselves when we turn our runes into strength at sites of grace. It is also important to note that while the spiritual potency of the Crucible's blessings are powerful, they also come at a cost. Tangled horns are a symbol of spirituality, but most young born bearing the oversized horns meet a frightfully early demise. These fetishes are made to memorialize them. While we know the Crucible's influence was strong within Rauh, because of the heavy price paid by those who come into contact with it, this nation's most important practice comes not from blindly receiving blessings, but from scientific study and technological advancement. The basis for much of Rauh's architecture rests upon two fundamental laws of the Crucible: that flowing water is a medium through which spirits are carried, and that such spirits can be forced to inhabit relics known as Rauh burrows. These stones can be found all throughout the ruins, but many are intentionally placed beside streams of running water. I think the implication is that the many prominent aqueducts, not just in Rauh, but in almost every Blackstone ruin, are used to charge these burrows, creating sprite stones from the spirits within the rivers. I've previously spoken at length on the relationship between water, death, and the Crucible, but for this topic, the description of Devonia's hammer referring to the Crucible as a torrent of life, the Spira incantation being a normalized current of Crucible power, and the spiral horn shield being a small shield of antlers arranged in an eddy-like pattern, sufficiently shows the relationship between these concepts. Returning now to the sprite stone, through the use of a bond stone, we can actually control the action of a spirit inhabiting a Rauh burrow. This ability is clearly extremely important to understanding Rauh, as the bond stone is found hidden behind an illusory wall before a statue of the goddess herself. While all we can do with the bond stone is cause a sprite to explode in a sudden release of energy, this is only the most basic form of the technology. This power, the ability to bend spirits to the will of the user, is as groundbreaking a development as electricity is in our world. Suddenly, those who are not inherently blessed by the crucible can utilize its power, without any fear of an early demise. It explains why water is so central to Rauh's architecture. Almost every ruin in the game, both in the Shadowlands and the lands between, are built around a source of flowing water. It is the most consistent characteristic of all of these ruins. So important is the power within water that it is even plausible that Rauh may have built the Forge of the Giants upon the mountaintop in order for its fires to melt the massive frozen lake near the mountain's peak, unleashing the sealed power within, and channeling it through their massive aqueducts. The Rauh ruins on the mountain do follow along the river after all. You may be thinking that we can create sprite stones from a Rauh burrow without water by using a beast horn and a spirit calculus. But this calculus is actually based on a kidney stone, which builds up from hard minerals within a water source. Even when we craft a sprite stone, the sprite itself came from flowing water. It was simply consumed by a beast of Rauh before. I've been harping for long enough about how important the ability to control spirits is. So how did the people of Rauh actually turn what seems at first to be a very simple technology into a vast empire? The answer lies within the ruined forges and the Golem blacksmiths which patrol their halls. Golems are constructs of stone given life by infusing them with souls. I consider the Golem smiths of the ruined forges to be the earliest form of the Golem, due to their rough-cut appearance in comparison to other Rauh constructs such as the Guardian Golems. The smithing talisman tells us that in ancient times smithing was a divine act, and blacksmiths interpreted the script they perceived in the wrinkles of molten steel to imbue weapons with souls. I think the fact that it is molten steel specifically that can be imbued with souls is interesting. Perhaps it is because in liquid form it mirrors the flowing water from which the sprites were originally extracted from. This would explain why such vast quantities of flowing lava are channeled through the forges, forming swirling pools and streams akin to the waters of Rauh. The divine art of smithing practiced within these forges, which is closely linked to the development of the first golems, represents a shift in Rauh's history towards a more violent disposition. I believe it was the development of the sprite stone and the subsequent creation of the golem smiths, which spearheaded the importance of smithing within Rauh's culture. It's also notable that even the act of subjugating spirits itself can be construed as rather cruel. The fact that it coincides with the worship of smithing and the creation of massive stockpiles of weapons is no coincidence. All of the golems associated with Rauh seem to be powered by fire sprites specifically, and the fire sprite stone tells us that of all the sprites, the fire sprites are said to be the most boisterous in nature. Rauh's golems were designed as weapons of war, and they required the most brash and fiery spirits to power them. In addition to golems, these forges were used to create the smith script weapons, which, like the golems, were infused with souls to give them powerful new properties. Imagine legions of soldiers bearing weapons who could be thrown and returned to their user endlessly, augmented with fearsome golems and giants. Suddenly it is clear why Rauh's ruins cover the entire continent. They were conquerors. To hammer home, pun intended, this idea that smithing coincided with a shift to more violent intentions, the gemstone which acts as a weak point for the golem smiths is very likely a red glintstone. The Staff of the Guilty explains that red glintstone is born from the blood of sacrifices, and that it is similar to hex magic in nature. If this is red glintstone, its link to the thorn sorcerers, and therefore the fire giants, is very interesting, especially when viewed alongside Rauh's shift in focus to fire and smithing. More on that later though. These golems were not just mindless machines. They had names, personalities, and even were honored in death. Telu was said to be the runt of the litter and the first to stop moving, but it was he who became the guardian deity of smithery. The idea of guardian deities, which originated in Rauh, are quite important for many cultures that follow it. Clad in golden armor and granted wings and feathers by divine invocation, Ornis succeeded in taming the divine bird and made its wings his own as he soared through the sky. When he finally fell to earth, he lived on as the guardian deity of the temple quarter. Ornis was a hornsent, and yet these distant ancestors of Rauh still follow the practice of honoring guardian deities. The temple quarter is a hornsent settlement within the lower Rauh ruins, which tells us that the divine bird which Ornis tamed lived within Rauh. The gold-hued divine birds are known to be cruel, never taking to human companionship. Those who invoke their divinity are few and far between. These divine birds are likely the mirror of the death birds, who are also characterized as cruel creatures. Golden divinity and cold death are simply two sides of the same coin, and both are linked to another, more important entity. Shield featuring a vividly painted twin bird. The twin bird is said to be the envoy of an outer god, and the mother of the death birds. While the twin bird isn't massively important to our story today, this is our first hint at the true fate of Rauh. The outer gods are sinister deities which exist as the twisted, occult shadows of natural processes within the lands between. There are a number of hints that the outer gods were exerting their influence upon Rauh, and I believe that this coincides with the civilization's turn to more violent and cruel tendencies. An underlying theme of the outer gods is that it is only after one becomes twisted that they are able to perceive and worship such beings. While other creators have theorized that Rauh was the only civilization to find balance with the outer gods, I believe the evidence instead points to the outer gods' influence spelling Rauh's doom and the end of their continental civilization. There are two dark deities whose influence on Rauh is clear: the outer god of rot and, of course, the fell god. The fell god's influence is considerably more apocalyptic, so we will save that for the end and first speak of the role of rot in this society. Verdigris is said to be the gift of an outer god, possessed of an enormously hefty yet supple strength thanks to its rusted nature. Corrosion is a form of rot, the breakdown of metal instead of flesh. Mor, who is closely linked to the god of rot, bears its gift, an impenetrable suit of armor strengthened by rust. The verdigris discus is found before a statue of the goddess overlooking a vast spring. The outer gods are shadows of nature, and I believe the god of rot is the shadow of abundance, and, in a way, the crucible itself. These life-filled spring waters have an occult side in that rotted abundance, which we see taken advantage of by the pests in the modern day. I believe the rot having influence in Rauh, evidenced by the verdigris discus, is not indicative of a balance between flowing water and stagnation, but instead of the gradual corrosion of Rauh itself. The verdigris' great shield states that the shield will continue to protect its target even if its bearer should die, and that is, in a way, what actually happened to Rauh. The civilization itself fell, yet the guardian golems, which share a similar form to the verdigris armor, continue to defend its ruins, despite the fact that there is no one left to protect. This finally explains why the Blue Fairy and the Blue Dancer, both of which are linked to Rauh, are so adamantly opposed to the god of rot. It is linked to the fall of their forebears. Returning to the verdigris discus, it is extremely important that the design of this talisman contains 8 small dots around a larger central circle. This is the most important symbol of the fell god, another malevolent deity to curse Rauh. Its single, malformed eye consists of a large central pupil surrounded by 8 smaller ones. The fire giants adorned themselves with what appears to be verdigris jewelry, and use a similarly rusted pan to catch embers from the flame of ruin. This really cements the idea that it was Rauh's worship of smithing, and their nature as violent conquerors which twisted them to the point at which the outer gods could prey upon their civilization. Verdigris is a gift of metal strengthened by the god of rot, but the process of shaping it, smithing, is the domain of the fell god. That is why the discus bears this symbol, seemingly linking it to two deities at once. What is interesting is that so much of Rauh is connected to this symbol. The octahedral stone pillars and the goddess's crown bear geometry which matches the fell god. The hammers within the ruined forages contain such swirls, which also mirrors the design of the troll's hammer. Trolls are descended from the giants, and these were supposedly once used as ceremonial smithing tools. In the distant past, smithing was considered divine. The fell god's influence is reflected in the practice of smithing, the creation of weapons with which to conquer. I don't believe that this deity was ever worshipped in Rauh proper. Remember that the ancient giants of the region lacked the face of the fell god found in the chest of the fire giants, but that the fell god exerted a subtle influence upon its culture, appearing to the giants as they became blacksmiths. Twisted gods appear to those who have become twisted themselves, and it is Rauh's subjugation of spirits, forcing souls into weapons of war, which caused some of its giants to stand before the fell god itself and take it as an object of worship. They would become forever changed by this meeting. The fire giants borrowed the power of a fell god, and still they were defeated, yet their failure released them from their solitary curse to serve as keepers of the flame for eternity. It is the fire giants' reverence for this god which I believe spelled the end of Rauh. The fell god is a being of ruin and destruction, the herald of the end of ages. The Forge of the Giants, which houses the fell god's flame of ruin, is a unique design compared to the rest of Rauh. It shares specific patterns of stonework with another set of massive structures which are key to our story: the Divine Towers. While their purposes remained largely mysterious, if we venture inside we can observe that they are inlaid with 8 glowing red meteorites which surround the center of the tower. This, alongside the fact they also share design elements which are unique to the Forge, is strong evidence that these towers were built by the fire giants. Reaching into higher spheres, they summoned their malevolent patron, which unleashed a ruinous apocalypse upon Rauh and its people. We do know that the distant descendants of Rauh, the Hornsent, fear this deity. The visage of the gruesome wickerman wielded by Mesmer bear a stone mask surrounded by curled horns, depicting the fell god of fire that haunts the sagas of the Hornsent. Alongside these masks, they also bear crude depictions of the fire giants upon their legs. The end of Rauh was so terrible that even after its ruins became buried by time, this event is still remembered. The fell god and its fire giants became feared as legends for eons to come. Next time we will follow the aftermath of the fall of Rauh and the subsequent loss of the Elden Ring. The descendants of this once great civilization will be forced into the underground in search of its lost power, but will eventually come to establish a great dynasty. If that story interests you, or if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing and leaving a like. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.